All right, good morning, everybody. We have a terrific discussion today. Glad you're here. I'm Jennifer Langley, manage our Southeast chapters for the CFO Leadership Council. And I have with me here today Jay Eisenberg, who's going to be helping with the welcome remarks in just one moment. Want to just do a few housekeeping rules. First of all, we want you to participate. So please, join in the conversation. It's a small enough group. You're welcome to, turn on your mic and audio visual if you'd like to discuss things during the conversation, or definitely at the end of the discussion when Brendan will do the breakout, the Q&A. And then also we're going to have a 15-minute breakout group after the session today to continue the conversation, do a little networking. So I hope you'll be able to participate in that. At the end of the discussion, we'll just basically put people in small 5, 6, 7 people breakout rooms so you can continue to discuss the conversation and meet one another. And we will do polling questions today. They'll be up on the screen for about a minute. So if you're looking for CPE and you're a member, please make sure and participate in those. And even if you're not a member, it's interesting to see the results of the questions. So now I'll turn it over to Jay.
Thank you, Jennifer. Welcome and happy, healthy new year to all. Hope you're all healthy, both physically and being sane. We have a great program this morning. First of all, I'd like to say thank you to all of our steering committee members. Thank you for joining and for your support. And then, okay. And then our next event will be on Tuesday, February 16th, a 2021 economic update with Tom Jalix. He's from Fifth Third Bank, Chief Market Strategist, 8 a.m. Tom's a great speaker. We've been fortunate to have him speak with us the last couple of years. He makes what could be very dry, a dry topic, interesting, informative. Obviously, nobody last year could have predicted what 2020 turned out to be. So I look forward on hearing his views, looking both back and forward. But he's a terrific speaker, and it comes with great insights. So personally, I'm looking forward to that. And then a special shout out and thanks to our sponsors. So Allie from Fifth Third Bank, and I'm not sure if Allie's on, wants to say anything.
She's here.
Hi, thank you very much. Good morning.
Good morning, Allie. And then Donna from NetSuite. Donna, are you on? Okay, and I believe Steve Clay is here. Steve, our account executive from Planful. Steve, good morning.
Hello, good morning, everybody, and glad to be here, and happy to be a sponsor for the South Florida chapter. And at Planful, we help companies manage and improve their FP&A processes for things like budgeting, planning, forecasting, financial consolidation. And if there's any room for improvement, we'd love to talk to you. Thanks.
Thanks, Steve. And Steve Roach from USI Insurance Services. I'm not sure if Steve's on or one of his colleagues might be on. Anybody want to say a quick good morning?
Good morning. This is Steve Roach. We're happy to be a part of this organization, and we're looking forward to being a part of this panel today, which should have some really good content.
Fantastic. Thank you, Steve. And then good morning, Tim Rubin. Are you on this morning?
I'm not sure if Tim's here, but Julia's here. If you want to say a few words, Julia, and then you're, of course, speaking on the panel.
Yes, good morning. Thank you so much for having us, and we're happy to be sponsors. At Kaufman Rawson, we provide a whole suite of services from accounting and auditing all the way through risk advisory services and consulting. Thanks so much, and glad to be here.
Thank you, Julia. Thank you all for being on the panel. And then just to talk about member benefits for a moment, so I didn't even really properly introduce myself. I'm one of the co-chairs of the South Florida chapter with John Stunson. I'm the CFO of TSC Miami, a casual apparel manufacturer. I'm one of the founding members of the South Florida chapter. It's really a great organization. Enjoy the camaraderie. the sharing of information, sense of community. The organization has great national events with content, events like this that are monthly, other than the break we take over the summer. CFO Connect, where you can ask questions about just about anything related to your challenges within your individual jobs or practices. So it's really a great group. So I would highly recommend checking us out if you're new and this is your first meeting. And I'm personally happy to answer any questions if anybody has any about being a member. So thank you for that. And with that said, I will turn it over to our esteemed panel to talk about the challenges with cyber security and fraud. And Brendan Griffin, it is all yours. Brendan is our moderator this morning from USI. And Brendan, I'll let you take it over. Thank you for doing this today.
Well, thank you, Jay, and thank you for inviting USI and myself again to host the cyber panel. If 2020 wasn't exciting enough and 2021 is even more exciting, we still have cyber threat as a challenge in our community and a challenge for each and every one of your organizations. So we hosted a panel like this last year. We're doing it again, and hopefully our panelists today will be able to shine a light on some of the emerging threats, some of the strategies in mitigating those threats, and more importantly, prevention of them. So hopefully we find value in not only this panel discussion, but in 2021 as a whole. So with that, I will introduce Brian, if you'd like to give a little words about yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. Good morning. Brian Minnick. I'm the Chief Information Security Officer at Fifth Third Bank. Pleased to be here and have an opportunity to talk to all of you. You can see from the brief description here, my background in information security goes back to General Electric. Was the Chief Information Security Officer for their aviation, energy, and transportation businesses. Moved from there, so actually started a managed cybersecurity services company that we grew and developed, focused on managed detection and response of threats. Sold that to Booz Allen Hamilton and spent some time getting that settled, and am now here at Fifth Third. So again, thanks for the opportunity. It's a pleasure to be here.
All right, great, Brian.
Hi, I'm Julia Marina. I'm with Kaufman Rawson. I lead the global privacy practice in the risk advisory group. Prior to joining Kaufman Rawson, I was a practicing attorney, and prior to that, a compliance officer. So I do bring a different perspective to this panel this morning. We're really focused on many of the aspects of cybersecurity and privacy with which we help our clients. So this is something that my background in investor protection and consumer protection really does play a role in many of the things that we do today with our clients, and we're glad to be here.
Thank you, Julia.
Well, good morning, and thank you for the invite to participate. I've done this before. The last session last year, Brendan referenced, I had stubble at that point. Now we're into a full-blown beard after a year here. So my name is Todd Power. I'm with USI based in Fort Lauderdale. I am within our technical resource team. And the value proposition is that we have individuals with very, very deep expertise in very finite areas. So I head up our EPS practice, which is the Executive Professional and Risk Solutions. So D&O, EPL, fiduciary, crime, kidnap and ransom, and cyber. Spent the better part of a decade with Marsh in their FinPro unit. Before that, I was an underwriter with Chubb in their executive protection unit. And now this is year 13 at USI, heading up the Southeast. So I look forward to the dialogue today, and certainly looking to entertain any questions or comments. Thank you.
All right, great. Well, I suppose we can get into our discussion, and I think I'd like to start with Brian. In your capacity, I mean, quite frankly, cyber is, to me, is somewhat of a generic term, what sort of threats are you seeing, and what are the threats that are emerging in the marketplace today?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think you're spot on. The term cyber is extremely broad and means a lot of things to a lot of different people. But at the end of the day, yeah, I think there's a couple categories of threats that as we take a look at what's out there, right? And it starts at kind of the bottom of the risk chain, if you will, is just folks that are out there just trying to earn a living. They live in parts of the world that don't have much economically, much in the form of jobs, but it has really good internet connectivity. So, you got a lot of folks. This was, if you remember, the Nigerian prince that was trying to give you a lot of money about, 10 years ago. They've evolved. They're doing these things and just trying to put some food on the table for their families. As you step up from that, you get into more organized crime. We see a lot of this within the banking sector. It's a lot that's driven on the dark web, ways of just stealing information and monetizing that. And it's just ways of making money from an organized crime perspective. So fairly sophisticated, well-resourced. This is a lot of what's driving the ransomware activities that we're seeing. And when you look at these two, the individuals and the organized crime, at the end of the day, I think that ultimately comes down to, when you think about cyber as a business model, it's really high reward and relatively low risk. So I just lost you guys here. So when you look at a high reward, low risk business proposition, you get what we're starting to see here, right? And then at the tippy top of this, and this is something that not many companies to worry about, but it's the nation state stuff. And this is what we're seeing with the SolarWinds, with the FireEye. This is a lot of what I dealt with at General Electric as a defense contractor. And that is, kind of the tippy top edge. And you can see, just as we look at SolarWinds itself, and the FireEye activities of just the last month or so, these folks are extremely well resourced. Will stop really at nothing to try to get in. So I think cyber is a spectrum. There's a number of risks and challenges that fall on that. I think as organizations, we just need to think through, understand those, and think through how they apply or how much we want to address in each one of those categories.
Sure. And Julia, what are you all seeing at Kaufman with regards to emerging threats to privacy and things of that nature?
Well, we're seeing a lot of new privacy regulations that are bringing in a lot more insult to the injury of a cyber incident. So now we're seeing some privacy regulations, particularly in California, with the California Consumer Privacy Act, that is actually bringing in some fines and penalties and punishment for actually having these cyber breaches. So there's a lot going on in the privacy space as a result of everything that's going on in the cyberspace. So we're seeing a lot of that now.
Sure.
Hey, Julia, real quick on that note, I saw recently that when ransomware, they were saying that a lot of those are embargoed organizations, and if you pay the ransom, you're actually kind of breaking the law. Is that, you seen that?
Well, yes, we are seeing some of that. I know that I believe OFAC came out with some guidance in that
Yes.
space as well.
Yes.
And yes, they are talking about, if you are paying, or you should not be paying these ransoms to these companies, because you can be violating other types of laws, particularly AML or other types of regulations. So absolutely, We're seeing a lot of changes there.
Puts the victims in a tough spot.
Absolutely. So now the victims are not only having to deal with this problem, but now also with potential regulatory and legal action.
Well, and from an insurance perspective, I think with this group obviously focused on the financial means or resources of the company, I think, and I'm hoping Todd can kind of touch on this. I think that the fear is that cyber hackers are going to hack into the system and steal the money. But there's an incredible cost element that goes into a hacking, just from, and I think Julia touched on it, some of the regulatory fines and fees and things of that nature. And Todd, how do you see that from an insurance protective standard or standpoint?
Well, the marketplace as it exists today is entirely different than the marketplace we saw a year ago or 3 or 5 years ago, in that there was a lot of capacity in the marketplace and therefore a lot of competition. I will tell you as a broker that the placement of cyber liability was traditionally a pretty easy placement in terms of leveraging the carriers to get good pricing, leveraging the carriers to get good terms and conditions. What we have seen over the last probably 9 to maybe 12 months, a year, is a complete and total hardening in the market. And cyber liability now is as difficult and challenging to place as public company D&O. So, underwriters have really latched on to ransomware as being a huge threat. And if you think about it from a cyber carrier's perspective, if you were a traditional manufacturer, what have you, you buy $1 million cyber limit for 12 to 15 grand, and 3 months later you get popped for $1 million ransomware loss. Take that up the scale to the other end of the spectrum. Now you're Target, now you're Home Depot, now you're Wyndham, whatever changes had a major breach, and $100 million cyber tower gets torched in the span of a month or two. So we could, to some degree, begin to see this coming. It's just the force with which it's hit right now. Most cyber carriers are requesting a lot more information than we had had in the past, in terms of questionnaires for ransomware, in terms of questionnaires for SolarWind. A lot of carriers now have minimum premium thresholds, where before, as a broker, again, you could kind of bump people back down. So it's a completely different environment. We've had carriers that are very traditionally very good in this space. They've walked away from deals, or on renewals, they had said pricing is going from X to X plus, this, and all of a sudden we're moving coverage. So, as we get into this discussion here, I do want to leave you with a couple of comments on how we can best prepare for a good outcome on our renewals also.
No, that sounds great. And that actually spurs kind of another question, a little off the cusp here, but Brian, in this work from home environment, I've heard, and I was, wondering if you could kind of touch on that a lot of the ransom attacks are increasing, or the cyber attacks rather, because people are working from home and have more compromised internet connections and things of that nature. Is that something you all are seeing or dealing with, or what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, we are seeing the attackers trying to exploit work from home situations. So if you look historically across all the attacks that are out there, generally you see around 12 to 15% of those attacks use new techniques and procedures. So that's attackers trying to figure out new ways of doing things and trying to take advantage of stuff. Since the work from home, that's went up to about 25 to 30%. So that kind of tells us that attackers see some opportunity here, and they haven't figured out how to fully take advantage of it at this point, but they are poking and prodding the fences, trying to find the gaps within this new work arrangement. So yeah, we're not. From my seat, I'm not seeing success on it at this point, but they are definitely trying, and it's a matter of time before they figure something out.
And are there things that companies that do need to have employees in a work from home environment, are there things that they can do to harden or somewhat safeguard, as if the employee was right there in the safety of the four walls of the office?
Yeah, I mean, well, when you look at your traditional, you got virtual private network, VPN, you've got things like Citrix that people use. Those are all well and fine, but when you look at how those were actually set up, especially VPN, it was made as a temporary solution. Like I'm home on the weekend, or I'm working from home for a week, and when you get into the long-term use of it, what you find is that some of the ongoing maintenance of the equipment, like the patching of your PC, for example, right? People haven't always thought through, how do I patch PCs when they're not coming into the office at some regular interval? So that becomes part of the challenge, is taking a look from a process perspective, the ongoing operations of your IT environment, and how can you maintain those assets and those machines when they're not coming into the office. Make sure your processes are properly accounting for that and dealing with it. It's one of the big pieces that people are kind of working through right now.
Sure. And Julia, what are you seeing with the work from home space? Are there any changes that your clients have experienced or threats with regard to cyber?
Well, at this point, we're really helping them focus on, preparedness, making sure that they have everything in place that they need, from vulnerability assessments to penetration testing. We've also helped them a lot with the compliance program surrounding this. So making sure that they have proper, security programs, privacy programs. So we're really helping them either on the incident response after something's happened, determining the extent of what's going on, or also the beginning parts, the preparedness part. So those are the two aspects that we're kind of seeing right now. At the beginning of the pandemic, we did see a big rush to the preparedness side, but now we're starting to see a little bit more on the response side, some determining the assessment of the risk of what's going on, of any cyber incident, and that aspect of it as well.
Well, and to dovetail on that, so in terms of fines, penalties, litigation, reputation, like what are you doing to address those issues or work with your clients on those types of issues?
Well, on that side, we're really focusing on, of course, like I said, the preparedness piece. But once you've already had a cyber incident and now you may be subject to these fines and penalties, there may be some potential litigation risk. At that point, we're helping them determine the extent of the risk. A lot of these regulations require notification, especially if they touch consumer data. And they also require, a very short time frame for this notification. So we're trying to help them determine the extent of the risk, determine if notification is required, do the assessment either with outside counsel or in-house counsel. So many of these are ways that we can help mitigate some of the fallout from these cyber incidents.
Great. And of course, coming back to Todd, will insurance pay for all of those fees and expenses if you have to hire a firm like Kaufman Rossen or pay for the notification expense? Is that a component of insurance that a company can offload through an insurance policy?
Yeah, a traditional cyber policy, if we kind of break down the insuring agreements, they're comprised of first party and third party insuring agreements. And what we often advise clients is that, if you are on the fence about buying cyber liability, and this is not as much the case as it was a year or two ago or 5 years ago, is that, remember, if it's structured properly, you get a one phone call access to a data breach team, okay? And that data breach team is going to consist of legal folks who are going to advise you with respect to what your legal obligations are if you have a breach or a suspected breach. Remember that you are going to incur liability with respect to the timeliness and the manner of notification. You're going to need help with forensics. You're going to potentially need help with credit restoration and credit monitoring, and you're going to want public relations. Now, all those services, if the program is properly structured, will be parachuted in on day one, typically within hours of your phone call to the team. So that's part of your first party component of the policy. Now, at this point in time, clients are very stressed at that point in time, and the questions come into the broker, are we covered, are we covered, are we covered? Typically, that conversation begins to take place a week or two afterwards, right? The data breach team is very, very easy to access, and the hurdles to get in are very low. When we talk about coverage for a breach, typically the claims are reasonably easy to get covered, unlike a D&O claim, right, where we've got covered and uncovered matters and covered and uncovered parties, and we need to allocate and deal with exclusions in the policy. A cyber policy, if you had a ransomware attack, if someone has locked up your information, someone has stolen your information, we're pretty much on our way to a covered claim. So to round that out, within the first party insuring agreements in the policy, you've got coverage for things such as business interruption, right? If you were to suffer a traditional business interruption loss, but at the hands of a cyber event, right? You could have a dependent business interruption loss, which is, somebody or something that you rely upon suffers a cyber liability loss themselves, which therefore has you suffer a business interruption loss. The cyber extortion claims, which we see a lot, and then data recovery, which is typically part of the ransomware attacks. From a liability perspective, there's their coverage for regulatory fines and penalties. There's coverage for defense cost settlements and judgments. If, for instance, you are in receipt or have responsibility for non-public pedigree information that gets out into the public domain, media liability, PCI liability, and then circling back again within that first party component, funds transfer fraud, social engineering type claims. So again, if it's properly structured, yes, you have access to folks like Julia. Whether they're a carrier provider, you can go outside of that. Again, a broker can advise you on those types of things.
Great. Well, and you did mention a very specific topic that I think is critical to this group, and I'm curious, Brian, if you, with regards to social engineering, which is a crime in the eyes of the FBI or the Department of Justice. However, many times it's not considered crime in a traditional crime insurance policy. What are you seeing, Brian, in terms of social engineering, and are there some ideas that Fifth Third are implementing to prevent against that, or what are your thoughts on that subject?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. You talk about crime and what is crime in the eyes of different folks. When you look at this, and this is, I think, goes back to some of Julia's comments at the beginning. Any cyber breach, the company that was breached was the victim of that, right? The hacker, the perpetrator, was the criminal who broke in. And don't get me wrong, there's a fine line here between the company just being negligent and allowing anyone to waltz on into the organization and take information, right? We have a responsibility there. But when you look at some of these breaches, you're dealing with very sophisticated attacks, very high end. I mean, right now, how many parts of our government are compromised by the SolarWinds thing, right? But yet at the same time, we tend to turn around and, similar to the ransomware piece, right? Hey, you were the victim of ransomware. And really what enables that is that there's no law enforcement for the folks who are executing these attacks, right? They can execute this, they're not brought to justice, and they just keep doing it. But then when you're the victim of it, you're turned into the criminal if you pay or, put in a tough spot. So I think it's a very difficult position that we're in right now. I mean, the internet has broken down the physical barriers that we are used to and that law enforcement is used to dealing with. And until we're able to figure out how to deal with that from a law enforcement perspective, this is going to continue. And social engineering is a big part of how those attacks take place. Rather than exploiting a computer, I could exploit a person. And at the end of the day, in a lot of cases, people are more exploitable than the computers are. And that's really what social engineering is about, whether it's just taking advantage of the fact that I get hundreds of emails a day and I process them very quickly and I might click on something that I shouldn't, or even, extremely well crafted things. I've seen attacks where a person would go to a conference on a certain topic in the industry. That conference would post on the internet, hey, here was the conference, here's some of the presentations, here's the attendee list, and then the attendees would get an email from the keynote. Looks like it's from the keynote. It is the slides, right? The content, but it's Trojanized. And when you open it, it didn't actually come from the keynote. It came from one of these social engineering attackers. And when you open up that PowerPoint, it installs a backdoor on your computer. So, some of these are very sophisticated and very complicated types of attacks. But yes, there's a lot that we can do to help address social engineering, whether it's the ongoing training and education of our employees. There's many firms out there that sell that kind of training. We'll craft phishing emails, for example, that you can test your employees on. We do a lot of that. There's also firms that are looking at how much information is out on the internet about you. Information that attackers could use to craft a well put together social engineering attack against your employees. So there's firms that gather that type of information. It's pretty eye-opening what's out there, and they help you clean it up, right? So either from a corporate perspective and protecting the company, or even just as an individual, right? I mean, I would love to have as much of that information that just kind of leaked out about me removed, if I possibly can. So, there are approaches like that, education, and those cleanup efforts that people can take to help address the social engineering part.
Well, that's probably a perfect segue to Julia. How are you addressing protecting privacy and on the front end prior to there being an attack?
Well, internally, we've recommended to customers that they focus on what data they have internally. So data minimization is huge and it's key, making sure that you're only collecting the information that you absolutely need and storing it or keeping it for as long as you absolutely need it. So with a lot of these new privacy regulations, we're seeing that they have requirements for data minimization, for reasonable, what they call reasonably necessary information, and for very strict retention policies. So, it's time to do an in-house cleanup, making sure that you have your data retention policy, that you're following that data retention policy in case, heaven forbid, something happens, you're only exposed to as much information as you have, whether it's a social engineering attack or an actual outside threat. You already have, an in-house exactly what only what you need to have. You're only going to be exposed to that extent. And also, data mapping, inventory of processing activities. A lot of these new privacy regulations also require that in order to facilitate the response when you do have a cyber event. Make sure you know what data you have, where it's located, how it's being processed. And that will actually help you with the response, because a lot of these new regulations do have a very short time period for responding or for notification. So if you have, let's say, a 72-hour or a 30-day window, you need to be able to move quickly. And that's why your cyber response plan or your incident response plan has to have these additional tools, this data mapping, these inventories, to make sure that you can quickly react. So those are two things that we're recommending to clients now in order to move from only the protecting of the data space to actually the privacy space that needs to go with it. Because the privacy component we're seeing is the more new piece for many companies. Unless you're in a traditionally regulated industry like financial services or healthcare, privacy is fairly new to you. If you're in retail, if you're in another type of industry, privacy was always an afterthought. It was just a privacy policy on your website, and that's it. You were done with privacy. But now we're seeing that privacy is being attached to everything related to security as well. So that's where we're trying to help clients move into a more proactive space with respect to both security and privacy.
No, that's great. And I can tell you, whoever compromised my cell phone number to the Social Security cancellation firm, I'm certainly not a fan. Now, and again, great segue to Todd. What are you seeing, Todd, with regards to the insurance carriers? Are they laying in terms of expectations of companies to really take the recommendations of what Julia laid out in terms of safeguarding on the front end? Because we all know insurance doesn't say, we'll just sell you a policy and hope nothing happens. What are you seeing with regards to that?
Yeah, what I would say is that they are becoming much more stringent in terms of the underwriting process around your controls. What I would also tell you is that, the frequency of social engineering claims, at least from what I have seen, has dropped off a little bit, in that there's a lot more awareness around it. Folks are aware. The training has been ramped up within all of our organizations. I will say, as I went through the hour-and-a-half training at USI, I thought I'd rather be doing my job. That's probably where my time should be spent. But now I see the value in it, because when I even see personal emails come in and you start to look for those telltale, the address doesn't look right, or there's one word off, or there's a capital letter, you just don't click on that stuff anymore. So what we preach to our clients is training, policy, and procedure. And what I would tell you with respect to social engineering claims, that if there was one type of claim that starts to head towards controllable within my arena, it's social engineering. In that, if the policy and procedure are in place, you can typically avoid these claims. What happens is human nature begins to creep in, We are all getting hundreds of emails a day. We are all multitasking. We're all moving as quickly as we can. We click on something, we meet somebody at the coffee machine a half hour later and say, we wired out the 100 grand. And they say, what are you talking about? Right? Whereas if we had followed policy and procedure, probably wouldn't have happened. As respects social engineering losses, it can be addressed by way of two policies. In no particular order, a crime policy can be endorsed to add an ensuring agreement for social engineering. The key is to review that language to ensure it is broad enough to include things such as product and not just money, right, if you make shipments out. Secondly, you want to make sure you avoid any type of callback verification language, which stipulates that the coverage is no good unless there was a callback or verification that you should wire the money. To which we say to underwriters who try to slap us with that language, that makes the coverage illusory. But not for the callback. Obviously, we would not have had the loss. The second place that we can address this exposure is within a cyber liability policy. Now, the next question where is that loss typically handled best? It is circumstance specific. I will tell you that we often will designate the crime policy to be the primary policy and the cyber liability policy to sit excess of that. So, the last piece of this discussion is the limits that are available, typically anywhere from 50 to 150,000, maybe up to 250,000. So relatively speaking, the limits are small, right? So be aware of that too. We're typically not going to find $1 million of social engineering coverage. All right.
Yeah, and it's funny because I'm in a Facebook group and I saw that somebody actually put a post that said, if you send $100 in gift cards to either Walmart or Target to us, we'll send you $1,200 back. And it just was reminiscent of the old email days of, like I think Brian, you mentioned the Nigerian prince. If you bail me out of jail, we'll send you $1 million. And so to me, it's things tend to come back. So I guess my question to you, Brian, would be is this ever going to end?
Oh, geez. The internet breaks down the physical barriers that we're used to. And when we think about security in our personal lives, right, we all understand that when we're looking for a house or a place to live, we want to live in a good neighborhood because crime happens somewhere else, right? And someone has to actually come to you and physically move from one place to another in order to bring crime to your neighborhood. What we don't realize on the internet is the internet's inherently a bad neighborhood. Anyone in the world who wants to try to do something nefarious can get to you just as easily as anyone else, right? So it is a bad neighborhood. And I think that's ultimately what we end up dealing with. So it breaks down these barriers, allows us to share information. It really, from a business perspective, is amazing. And society, I mean, all these great things, but the other side of it is it can still be used for nefarious purposes. And I think a lot of it is similar to, in my mind anyway, I use the analogy of the Wild West, right? When the West was being tamed in the US, you just had this wide open space. It wasn't governed. There wasn't a lot of law enforcement that was able to, impact and influence things. What you found was, companies were hiring their own private security forces, whether that's the Pinkertons or even, Wells Fargo for secure, transport of materials. And I think you're starting to see the same thing in the cyberspace, where large companies are creating very large security organizations. Whether it's the organization I personally lead, the defense sector, all the big folks, there's this very they're able to afford their own private security force, cyber security force. We call them security organizations. And the challenge there is not every company can afford that. So how do you deal with that if you can't hire several hundred people with very specific skill sets around detection, threat intelligence, reverse engineering of malware, signature creation, forensics, let alone all the regulatory pieces and all that, right? I mean, it's a lot. So how do you do that? And you're starting to see a lot of managed services coming up that are helping people with that can bring scale. Because when you think about detection and response to attacks, that's something that you need 24/7 coverage on, right? It's not like the attackers go home at 5 o'clock Eastern time and then come back at 8. It's a 24/7 piece. So you need people constantly monitoring your environment. Well, that takes, in order to do 24/7 at minimum shifts, you need at least 12 people to do that, right? How many companies have 12 people's worth of work within that space today? Then you need incident response and forensics folks. So, if you got an incident, you're probably going to need at least 2 people working 12-hour shifts on and off to cover that. Then you got threat intelligence folks, and the list goes on and on. So no, I don't see the threats going away. I made the point earlier about law enforcement trying to figure out how to deal with this. Until then, these private security forces, security teams are going to have to step into the gap and try to hold the line as best they can. And I think for a lot of companies, that means finding a solid partner that can bring those skills and those capabilities to the table for them at a price that they can afford, instead of insourcing and trying to build that themselves.
That's a perfect segue to Julia, I suppose. So for a large organization like Fifth Third, they have the capacity to hire a cyber team. But if I'm a smaller organization, I don't have the budget to hire an entire cyber task force. Can I offload or contract that out to a company like Kaufman to really outsource and manage the IT safeguards?
Well, absolutely. And that's exactly what we help clients with. We tell our clients it's not a matter of if this will happen, it's a matter of when, and it's a matter of being prepared. So we partner with our clients both on the before aspect of it. They can outsource many of these functions to us. We can do the risk assessments, the audits, all of the reports. And we also help them with, the policies and procedures, with training the employees, simulations of the processes. We can, help draft particular policies. So all of this, they can also, if they don't have a person that does it full time, they can also outsource it to us, whether it's the security officer function, the privacy officer function. Many of these, the incident response aspect of it, we can go in and do the evaluations. We have a forensics team. We have all of the cyber experts as well. So we can do a lot of this in pieces. So they don't have to, do everything in-house themselves. They can always pick what pieces they need the most urgently and then outsource that to companies like ours. We definitely can go in there and just, what it would take a long time for an individual employee to do, we have a full team that can go in and take care of it in a couple of weeks. So definitely.
And we liken ourselves to an outsourced risk management brokerage because again, there are large companies that have an entire risk management division, and then obviously smaller middle market companies outsource. So with that in mind, Todd, what should this group be expecting from their broker? I know it's a lot of times it's just placing coverage and knock on wood that nothing happens, but what would you say to this group in terms of an expectation or how they should be really directing their broker with regards to how they're safeguarding the company?
Well, I think it begins with communication, thorough communication, and that begins probably 180 days in advance of the renewal. It's delivering and talking about expectations. I would tell you, generally speaking, what we are counseling our clients is to expect 15 to 25% increases. That by no means says that we just roll over and take it from the carriers, but we need to provide line of sight. What I would tell you is that, a successful renewal is one whereby we create a story for the underwriter, right? Story about us doing the right things, having all the best practices in place, from training to backup systems, patch management, filtering email and web content, monitoring that network activity, limiting access to people who really need access to certain things, reviewing vendor security. That's kind of table stakes, right? So when we really begin to get into the meat and potatoes, it's really kind of conveying to that underwriter that, we're doing, again, those right things in an even deeper way. Vulnerability tests, identity and access management controls are being managed. data backup and restoration procedures. To Julia's comments, what data do you have? How are you backing it up? How often are you backing it up? Where are you backing it up? Can it be segregated? Encryption and tokenization, right? From a legal compliance perspective, HIPAA, SEC, GDPR, all those things. We really want to try to convey to an underwriter a sense of security, right? Underwriters are in the risk transfer business. Losses happen. What an underwriter wants to avoid is a situation whereby they miss something. And now their management is saying, listen, you just cost us $5 million in the loss. Had you done your job, had you pushed them harder on questions? So that is really the beginnings of a successful renewal. It's communicating with clients in terms of our strategy. Are we going to partner with our existing carriers? Are we going to go out and market? I would tell you that a cyber liability program is probably not something we want to move around an awful lot. What we probably want to do is do the hard work at the beginning, get a good program in place, and then throughout each successive renewal, we want to continue to optimize the program with the latest coverages, right? 9-10 months ago, it was BYOD. Make sure you have that extension on your cyber liability policy, right? GDPR, make sure you have that extension on. So it's a refinement process, but I would tell you that the cyber liability renewals are quite challenging these days. So get on them early and make sure you have a good game plan in place.
Yeah, wow. This is certainly a lot to take in. So Brian, I am the new CFO of Fifth Third Bank, and cyber is under my purview. So you and I are sitting with each other. How should I be thinking about dealing with these threats and working towards better protecting the organization?
Well, within the bank, I break it down into a couple broad categories for folks. First is the regulatory pieces, right? And a lot of what we've talked about today, having the foundations of the program in place. Are we managing identities? Are we managing assets, patching, backups, encryption, all those things, right? Which make this space, I think, very confusing, and a lot of leaders' minds just shut off as you start getting into patching and vulnerability and all these techie geek terms, right? So I say, look, that's the basics. We got to get that covered, right? That keeps the foundation in place. It needs to be there, makes everything else work once you have that. But the risks that we really take a look at is external risks. So folks from outside the organization trying to break in and steal or disrupt, and internal threats. Folks inside the organization trying to steal and disrupt. And we really break it down into those two broad categories and create programs around those. For example, when I present my metrics to the board, I have a set of metrics around external threats and a set of metrics around internal threats and how we deal with those. And basically lining things up from that perspective. From there, what I primarily measure for folks to help them understand how effective we are is for both of those two threat categories. How quickly do I detect an attack or a threat? And then once I detect it, how quickly do I contain it and stop it from being able to do whatever it's trying to be able to do? So mean time to detect, mean time to contain metrics are key for us. And then we use something called the Lockheed Martin put this together a while ago. It's called the cyber kill chain. So, it comes from a defense contractor, so you have to have kill chain in there somehow, some way. But basically, the idea is these cyber attacks don't just happen. Data doesn't just leave. There is a set of steps that an attacker has to go through before they can successfully execute their attack. And what you care about is how early in that chain of events do you detect the attack? So we kind of show these things in a multi-layered grid, which is, how quickly do I detect it, mean time to detect, how early in the kill chain did I detect it, and then how quickly do I contain it? And what you want to do is obviously drive down your detect and contain times while also moving your detections up the kill chain earlier in the attack process. So that's how we talk through that. from a new CFO perspective, how we think about how we're protecting ourselves, how we think about the risks, and how we think about the measures that show how effectively we're doing that, clearly over and above the foundational elements that need to be in place as well.
And Julia, thank you, Brian. I guess my question would be, what are your thoughts on some key takeaways that some of the folks in this group can go back to their office today and start implementing some safeguards and things to really just, work towards preventing a cyber incident?
Well, as we already know that security has always been the beast that that we know well. Don't sleep on privacy. That's something that we're really focusing on lately. As Todd mentioned, GDPR, for example, and CCPA are really big issues. So what we're recommending constantly lately is make sure you have a policy in place. Make sure you're covering some of these new privacy regulations, because sometimes we are already used to the security aspect of it, of protecting our data, of having that security response. But we're missing that key component of privacy that going forward is going to be a real issue for the bottom line, because some of these, like I said before, these penalties and fines are extensive. If you do any, global business, GDPR's fines can go up to 4% of global revenues for the prior year. And if you do business here in the States, CCPA in California, you're looking at a private right of action that can subject you to, litigation from the individuals whose data has been compromised, or even directly a class action. So make sure that when you're evaluating risks and you're looking at your security program, make sure you have that privacy component in there. Make sure you have that response piece to do the evaluation and the notifications. So one thing that you can take away today and begin, if you haven't already, is, figure out where your data is. Create your data map, your inventory, know what you have, what you're processing, what you're using it for. If you don't need it, clean house. That's something that you should definitely be doing sooner rather than later. Also, making sure that, the users that you have only the access to what they're required to for their function, not giving them broad access if they don't need it. So those are just a few key things that we're recommending a lot lately, because especially with this working from home and working remotely component of the pandemic, we're definitely seeing that is something that you can definitely use to protect today.
So so if I'm hearing it correctly, the privacy notice is almost kind of like the valet slip that says, we're going to take your car and we have no responsibility whatsoever to anything that happens.
Yes, the privacy policy alone is not going to protect you. You have to have something in the background to, to be able to comply with what you're saying you're doing. The privacy policy now, it's just, it's just wording if you can't back it up. You got to make sure that whatever you're putting on there, you can do. If it says that you're only using it for a XYZ purpose, you have to make sure that you can only use it for XYZ purpose. If you're saying that you're not sharing that data with any third parties, that you're not sending it across borders to a server in Turkey, you better be sure that that's exactly what you're doing. So make sure that whatever you put in that policy, first of all, that you update it, because we all know that that's probably at this point, if it's more than 12 months old, it's probably, invalid at this point. Go back, revisit it, update it, to apply whatever regulations apply to you, to your company at this time, and then make sure you have the framework behind it to support it. Make sure if you have to provide access to users, if they request you to delete their information, that you can do so. If they request a copy of their information, that you can do so. If you are going to share it at some point in the future, that you're able to, that you're disclosing the sharing practices. So, that privacy policy alone is not going to protect you. So make sure that you take it, review it, you take into account what you're doing with it, and you go ahead and put a framework behind it. And of course,
Kaufman can help with the regulatory for both state and federal in terms of consulting on those matters, right?
Absolutely. One of the hottest things I've been working on lately is GDPR. A lot of our clients work, globally, and GDPR is a big component that they're required to have. And GDPR is fairly recent, from about 2 years ago. So that's been the hottest topic lately. And even companies in regulated industries like financial services and healthcare, now they're looking at these other regulations because they believe, oh no, we're HIPAA compliant, or we're GLBA compliant. We don't need that. That's not the case. These regulations are designed to be across industries, all industries are applicable to all industries. So you need to go ahead and revisit not only your HIPAA and your GLBA compliance, but also a lot of these new regulations. And yeah, Kaufman, we can definitely help with all of those. We help drafting the policies, the programs, and even putting them in place.
Perfect. Now, Todd, we're going to have to get into the nitty gritty here. So I am a CFO. I am a director and or officer of the company. What are your thoughts with respect to D&O exposure for the CFOs themselves in the cyberspace?
Yeah, I would say that this is a time of the highest vigilance. This needs to be a board level priority. What I would tell you is going back in memory 5, 6, 7, 10 years ago, when we would talk to clients or prospective clients about cyber, the typical response is it couldn't happen here. We are too small. The CISO at that point would feel this is an indictment on his or her job of what they were doing. Now, probably the greatest job security in the world is to be a computer information security officer. I don't know how you sleep anymore at night.
Todd, it's role security. It's role security, not job security.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah, depending on how things go for you. And again, we hear from clients, we're small, wouldn't happen here. Who would want to attack us? Owing to Brian's comments, this has become an industry overseas. Folks put on suits, they put on ties and jackets and drive in nice cars to buildings just like we work in. And they exploit the vulnerabilities of organizations all around the world, right? And there's no government oversight, so it runs like a traditional business. Also, and I will get to the question, I'm sorry, I'm rambling a little bit, but, a comment that I think it was Brian that made, maybe it was Julia, going back to OFAC. Think of the severity of this. Ransomware attacks are going through the roof right now. We are seeing them on a weekly basis, easily into the millions of dollars. And our government, right or wrong, not saying that, is saying you can't pay them. So, we have carriers from a Beasley to a Chubb to an AIG to a CNA that is ready to cut a $4 or $5 million check if your data has been held in ransom, and they can't do it. So now we really need to back into the board level implications of this, because remember, a D&O policy is an all risk policy. It's designed to cover the decisions or lack thereof that a board makes in their capacity. So you can see whereby now cybersecurity becomes a real board level discussion. Now, oftentimes these days, carriers are trying to put in exclusionary language into a D&O policy for cyber claims. We will fight that tooth and nail. We'll try to avoid that best we can. And I do believe that a D&O policy is the purview, right, should be a vehicle to transfer that risk, not the actual cyber loss, not the, the notification of folks, not the PR cost, not the credit restoration. But if somebody were to hold a D&O responsible for a decision he or her made or failed to make that led to that, which then ended in damage to the balance sheet and potentially my investment, yes, I would expect the D&O policy should react to that. So that's a whole nother panel. My beard at that point in time will be much longer, but we can discuss that at length also.
Great. All right, guys. So we do have some questions that have come in from the group. So I will start with Brian, and we can individually address these. So the first one I have here from Manuel Velez, somewhat similar to how auto insurance companies have driving monitoring tools, security policies to get reduced rates, do cyber insurance policies, well, I suppose this is probably to Todd, include a monitoring system tracking to assist companies review compliance, maintain training, and detect gaps?
The answer to that is yes. Certain carriers do want access. They will ask for access. They will monitor. Whether that is a good thing or a bad thing is a completely separate topic. To some degree, you're letting the fox into the hen house. They can say that the information won't be used against you in the underwriting process, but for me, it's hard to believe it won't be. So yes, carriers will want to get involved. Doesn't mean you have to. I think it's something that you want to discuss with your broker and discuss internally if you want to go that route. As Julia has said, there are outside firms, right, that can perform those services also, that can perform penetration tests. You frankly, you want to do all this testing when you're in port and seas are calm, right? We don't want to do this in the middle of a hurricane 3 miles off the coast. So right now is the time that you should be engaging the services, again, of a Kaufman Rawson, to be doing some of these services to ensure that, heaven forbid, a loss does take place. We are positioned. We have contingency plans, right? We've got our strategy mapped out. We've got roles and responsibilities mapped out, right? So we're not figuring this out in the heat of a loss.
Brian or Julia, do you have any thoughts on the topic?
Absolutely. I agree with Todd. Exactly. The time to do this is now, before you have an incident. And, the better prepared you are, the better you are in the insuring process, and also, in the response process to an incident. So I would completely agree with Todd.
Yeah, and tying back to, sorry,
go ahead.
I said tying back to the comments we had around this remote work environment, right? And I made the point of taking a look at all your processes that kind of run all these things. How does your incident response process work when not everyone's in the room, right? Does it require everyone to sit there around a whiteboard to track what's going on, or do you actually have the tools, equipment, the ability to work remote, to communicate effectively, all these different things, right? And I think to Todd's point, running exercises, whether it's a war game, whether it's a penetration test, whether it's a red team, folks actually trying to break in, testing these things out, and all those processes in this new work environment is also key specifically at this point in time, how we're operating.
Yeah, and I would just quickly add is, think about when the dust settles, right? You've been attacked from two fronts. You had a cyber liability loss, right? You're going to need all those first-party breach response services. You're going to need defense. There could be judgments and settlements against you. So that's one avenue. But think about it from a D&O perspective also. Wouldn't it be nice to demonstrate board-level notes, meeting notes, minutes that demonstrate that we've dealt with this? Wouldn't it be good to be able to convey we had plans in place, execution plans, all that are defenses to show that this stuff happens, and it happens all the time, but at least you have taken the time and energy to attempt to deal with it ahead of time, as opposed to, oh my God, we have no plan in place, we flopped on the deck, and now we've done damage to the balance sheet.
Well, I suppose that's a perfect segue to another question that came in. I think this one to Brian: how to best manage cybersecurity and fraud risks that may arise non-accidentally from current or former employees. And there's a caveat also: given the potentially expansive damage caused by cybersecurity and fraud, are there any best practices on quantifying these risks and assessing appropriate liability and prevention coverage? So I think that's probably a split Brian Todd question, but Brian, I'll start with you.
Well, yeah, and actually I think it goes back to a lot of what Julia was talking about on the data privacy front and how you're dealing with these things, right? So having the appropriate controls in place around the data. Julia mentioned understanding where your data is, what do you have, where is it, cleaning up information that you don't need anymore, and making sure that it's not there, right? Companies pay a lot of money to store data that they don't use and they don't need. So in other words, you're paying a lot of money to retain risk. You're paying money to retain risk. So clean that up, get rid of it, and that reduces. People call that the attack surface in some areas, right? So it reduces the surface area upon which someone can do something bad, right? So if the data's not there, they can't steal it. Great, fantastic. So getting those privacy pieces in place, cleaning that information up is key, and then understanding the use of that data and where it's going. So that gets you into not just employees that you're dealing with, but also third parties that you're sharing that data with, or that is processing that data on your behalf, whether that's a cloud service that you're using to make some decision or to execute some part of your business process. it spiders out very quickly. So mapping those things out, understanding those things, I think are key to the insider threat that we were talking about and touching on. And I'll let Todd talk about the insurance part of that.
Oh,
Yes, I would add that rogue employees are a real concern, right? We have attack vectors that come from outside the organization, but we can certainly have rogue employees. And that depends, again, on the information we have. If we think about the exposures, a lot of people don't stop to think about this, right? Paper is an exposure, and paper pedigree information is covered by a cyber liability policy. So think of unshredded documents, dumpster diving, file cabinets that are sold or donated, right? Think about it from an electronic perspective: computers, smartphones, backup tapes, hard drives, servers, copiers, fax machines, scanners. All those are exposures. And again, if you're an organization that has or could be held responsible for third-party information, say credit card information, it wouldn't be that challenging for a rogue employee to try to use that to their own benefit. And again, a cyber liability policy would react to rogue employees.
Brendan, one other thing I think I want to add as we're talking through this. When you think about insider risk, there are a lot of tools that help companies deal with that type of thing, whether it's data loss prevention technology, which kind of actually tracks specific data that you've tagged as sensitive and important and doesn't let it leave the organization, to user analytics and tracking the motions and what a user is doing within the organization looking for anomalous activity. There's a number of approaches to dealing with that and a number of tools out there to help folks control that information, and they all flow into and support an overall data privacy program as a totality of a way of dealing with this.
and so Julia, is this one of the areas that you do as a threat assessment or something with your clients?
Absolutely. We do full privacy risk assessments as they compare to their existing programs and identify any gaps that they may have. And sometimes companies don't even know where to begin with privacy. They think, well, the last time we touched privacy was a privacy policy 10 years ago. So we'll go in and we'll help them determine the steps needed to take to get their privacy program off the ground, to implement one. So we'll do the privacy policy gap analysis. We can also do the security program gap analysis to determine if there are any components missing or incomplete. We then do the risk assessments to determine, the risk within their existing programs once it's already been implemented. We do the training for employees to get them up to speed. We do the annual board trainings. We do several of these services that can just be outsourced to companies like ours.
No, that's great. Another question that just came in: should a medium-sized company be concerned about the SolarWinds breach? We've heard that more third-party vendors have been affected than has been publicly disclosed. Is this just a big company problem?
Yeah, I can speak to that. It is. Yeah, it's a problem across the board for anyone who uses SolarWinds. I think the challenge there is a lot of folks have had the SolarWinds backdoor installed in their environment. Whether the attackers took advantage of it or not remains to be seen. But you're talking 18,000. SolarWinds said 18,000 potentially impacted customers, companies out there. And if you're put yourself in the attacker's shoes, right? You just executed this thing. Now you've got 18,000 fish in your net. You got so many fish you can't process and deal with them, so they're being selective about who they go after. So yeah, it's impactful. If you have SolarWinds, please get rid of it, shut it off, and try to replace it. But yeah, it's something that everyone who's a customer needs to be thinking about. It's not just a big company issue.
Yeah, and remember my comments earlier. Find no safe harbor in, we are small, we're under the radar, they would go after big companies. Find no safe harbor in that thinking.
Yeah.
I think Brian said it well. There's 18,000 fish in the net. It's a buffet.
Right.
And now
and you don't know. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Julie.
just really quickly. And now's the time to go ahead and review your third-party vendor agreements if you haven't done so already. Some of those are dated. Some of those have the responsibility on the wrong party. Some of those may not have been updated recently. So go in there, take a look at your third-party vendor agreements. If you have any outside service providers, go back and review those agreements. Make sure that, the liability or the responsibility is assigned to the appropriate party. Make sure that you detail who's going to handle this in the event of an incident. Make sure that all of that's in there. And a lot of them, you'd be surprised, haven't been updated in a very long time. And now is the time to take a look and review those.
No, I just want to
and-
point out,
and-
we talked about 18,000 fish in the net. We don't know what criteria the attackers are using to figure out which fish they're going to pull out. In a previous role, I ran an incident response forensics company, and so many times we would respond to an incident in a company where the leaders were just baffled as to why would they come after us? And time again, you would just find that it was a customer that they had. It was a piece of information that they had. They were actually helping on a deal that this group of attackers wanted to know about. You just don't know. And so many victims are just surprised that they would be the target of this.
Well, if I could make
Yeah,
a comment to that, Brian, we find a lot of times in the middle market space, smaller companies say the hackers are going to want to go after Federal Express or Fifth Third Bank or Home Depot. But hackers know that companies like Fifth Third Bank have a team of folks like Brian under on their payroll. Smaller, medium-sized companies, they know, don't have the resources to employ an entire team. So that's something to take into consideration. I didn't mean to interrupt you, Todd.
Yeah, and remember too that that Julia's comments, that transfer of liability, right? The certificate of insurance that stipulates this third party has X insurance in place. It is incumbent upon you to have your broker review those policies in that language, right? Because remember, when you get a certificate of insurance that says XYZ cloud company has this insurance in place, it doesn't stipulate if they've got open claims. It doesn't talk about the breadth and scope of that coverage. It doesn't talk about, how impaired is that limit. So then therefore, we arrive at the conclusion that certainly you want to transfer as much of this liability onto those third-party vendors as possible, but a robust policy of your own is your first line of defense. Because if something happens, for instance, at that cloud service provider, I'm going to work under the assumption that I won't be the only one affected. So I don't want to be standing hat in hand with 10,000 of their other clients waiting for my data breach team to get to me. I'd rather react with my own policy, preserve my organization, organization, go back and subrogate against them afterwards. But a review of those contracts is very important in the process.
Great. Are there any other questions from the group that anybody would like to chime in, whether chat or by voice? All right. Well, I think that we are coming to the end of the panel discussion here. If I'll turn it over to Jennifer, I just want to thank everybody for taking the time to talk all things cyber, and a virtual round of applause to our panelists for coming out early this morning and speaking all things cyber. And without further ado, I'll turn it back over to Jennifer.